Ben and Dan were born 14 years ago. They were identical in every way. They were the same weight, they cried at the same time and slept at the same time. They took their first steps in unison and spoke their first words in chorus. They had the same favourite food and the same favourite toy. When they got older, they also got the same scores in all their tests. At parents' evenings, their teachers would always describe them as being very popular children with generous, friendly personalities. During sports days, they would always finish the running races with identical times. They both attended Cubs and had achieved an identical number of badges. They were great kids and were both very proud of the amount of sponsorship money they had raised during their last school charity event. They both loved cars and playing driving games on their computer. When they got older, they both dreamed of becoming paramedics, rushing round saving people's lives. Ben and Dan were inseparable. What one did, the other also did. However, just a few weeks ago, for the first time, there was a slight difference. Ben and Dan had just arrived home after school and were watching television. Their mum entered the room and asked if they could help their next-door neighbour move some boxes down from an upstairs bedroom. A little bit reluctantly, Ben agreed, but Dan didn't, saying that he felt a little bit ill. Little was it realised that this most innocuous of differences would lead to such profound consequences. As Ben continued to move boxes, Dan continued to watch TV. Whilst flicking through channels, he stumbled across a programme called Real Life Close Shaves. A particular image affected him deeply. It was of a man who very nearly became trapped inside a burning car. The programme finished, the boxes were moved, and Ben and Dan continued to mirror each other exactly, but with just one difference. When Dan's eyes were closed at night, he would often think about that frightening image and how petrified he would be in that situation. Fire became something that he became increasingly wary of, whereas before he had not really considered it. Only a couple days later, Ben and Dan heard a knock at the door. They both stood up at the same time and answered the door at the same time. It was a kind-hearted man who wanted to share his love for the Lord. He went on to explain that a man called Jesus loves both of the brothers equally, and that he selflessly died for them so that they could be saved. The kind-hearted man also explained about the consequences of not believing as he believes. Ben found the man's words as confusing as he did amusing. Dan found them significantly more worrying. In fact, he was scared to death of their fiery possibility. Over the next minutes, hours and days, Dan gave genuine thought to his words. Just a week or two later, as Ben and Dan were walking on their way to school, the unthinkable happened. On the peripheries of consciousness, and with an ever-relinquishing grip on life, both of the boys' minds raced. Ben thought of his parents and his brother strewn beside him. Dan couldn't help but think of the words and concepts that had so preoccupied him over recent weeks. In truth, Dan had fully opened his heart to the concepts expressed by the kind-hearted man as soon as he heard them. He knew that Jesus could be his only sanctuary. But now, and with absolute and genuine conviction, he pledged his love for the Lord. And so, Ben and Dan's fates were sealed for all eternity. With sentence passed and Ben's rejection of the loving and forgiving God confirmed, the inseparable brothers were to be prized apart, with impassioned pleas falling on deaf ears. As Ben descended, to be engulfed and enveloped by an infinite existence of sadistic and diabolical malevolence, Dan was beyond distraught. As God saw this, he sprinkled him with magic, transforming him from a thoughtful, kind and empathetic boy into an angel blissfully unconcerned by his best friend and brother's horrendous and tortuous fate, or that they would never see each other ever again.